Palestine would be decolonized. That's a fact that people should understand. You can delay the disintegration of Israel, you can delay the decolonization, but you won't succeed in stopping it. And it's, in fact, for the benefit of everyone, the Jews and the Palestinians, having the right conversation instead of the wrong conversation is really what is important. And the two-state conversation is not the right conversation.
Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today it is my distinct pleasure to sit down with historian and professor Ilan Pappé. Ilan, welcome to the show.
Great to be on your show, Mohammed. Thank you for inviting me.
There are very few people that can stand shoulder to shoulder with you when it comes to the breadth and the detail with which you have documented the history of Israel and Palestine. You are prolific, to say the least. You're the author of more than 12 books. I don't know if you have a specific number in your...
24.
24 books, so double what I had in mind, which is astounding. And, I mean, just this year alone, you published 2 books. Lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic, and the latest, which is a very short history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I want to ask a provocative question to begin with, which is, you have spent the bulk of your career documenting this specific story. What is it that you're looking for? Is there something that you have been driven by to try and analyze what is happening in Israel and Palestine with this much detail, with this much veracity?
The main drive is to challenge fabrication and injustice, which go together in my mind. Namely, the way the history of Palestine is being still today taught, told, covered by the mainstream media, by the mainstream academia, by the mainstream political establishment, especially in the global north, but also in some parts of the global south, is a very important factor in the continued oppression of the Palestinians. And therefore, I do believe that challenging the dominant narrative of what happened 70 years ago and what happened a year ago is an important part of the struggle to help the Palestinian to regain what justly is their freedom, independence, and self-determination. And that is my main motive. I really would like people to understand that it's easy to substantiate the Palestinian claims, to prove them through archival work, through professional work. And I hope that by establishing a factual infrastructure for the Palestinian claim and history, more people would be persuaded that the struggle of the Palestinians is just and would support it. Because as we know, if you listen to mainstream media, let's say here in Britain, the historical version that they tell immunizes Israel, provides Israel an exceptional position by which it can perpetrate ethnic cleansing and nowadays even genocide, and still be defined as a democratic state defending itself. And part of this, these descriptions are anchored in a certain historical version of what is Israel and who are the Palestinians.
And you outline your argument here, and you reiterated at the end by saying that we need to change how we talk about Israel and Palestine, that there's no point talking about peace as if both sides are equally at fault, when the process we're really talking about is decolonization. How does looking at Israel through a colonial lens help us better understand its history?
Well, we actually look at Israel through the lens of settler colonialism, which is a version of colonialism. And if we understand well the concept of settler colonialism, we can even understand what motivates Israel today in its genocidal policies in Gaza. Settler colonialism is a movement of Europeans that were outcast, like the Jews, in Europe for whatever reasons, and Europe didn't want them. But they still wanted to be part of Europe, so they built a new Europe outside of Europe. But quite often they chose countries where someone else already lived in, the indigenous native population. And as the late great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, says, at the moment these settlers encountered indigenous native population, a logic of the elimination of the native was enacted or activated. And this is also true about Zionism. There are some noble motives or impulses behind the idea of Zionism. Jews in Central and Eastern Europe were definitely facing a new surge of anti-Semitism in the 19th century that eventually led to the genocide of Jews in the mid-20th in the 1930s and early 1940s. So this was a genuine part of the genuine attempt by Jews everywhere in Europe to try and face an existential threat. But the moment they decided, and many of their allies, or those who became their allies for different reasons, decided that the best way to deal with anti-Semitism in Europe is to settle the Jews forcefully in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. Zionism became from a project that meant to salvage Jews, it became a settler colonial project. And working on that logic that I just mentioned, the elimination of the native, and you do it by working in two dimensions that you can see now in action in the Gaza Strip very, very clearly. There's always a wish to take over the space, the geography, the country, as much of the country as possible. Which Zionism tried to do from when the first settlers arrived in the late 19th century. And whenever you take more territory, you have more of the indigenous population that you want to get rid of. And from in the last 120 years, Zionism did all it could to take as much of Palestine as possible and leave in it as few Palestinians as possible. The methods, the means have changed, of course, according to the historical circumstances and the level of Palestinian resistance or anyone who came to help the Palestinians. But this is still the logic, the DNA of the Israeli state when it comes to facing the presence, the demographic presence of the Palestinians. Even before one Palestinian is involved in an act of resistance, they are targeted by Israel as a problem. And that is very typical of settler colonial movements such as the ones that established the United States, that went through the genocide of the Native Americans before it created a modern Western democracy.
And I grew up in New Zealand, which is
another one, yeah.
Settler colonial state that has its own story and has its own way of wanting to kind of reframe its past. And the common link, of course, is Britain. And Britain, as well as the United States, like to see their role in Israel as a savior of Jewish or persecuted European Jews. And the United States, since the creation of the State of Israel, has been one of its staunchest allies. And similarly, today we see the way in which American leaders talk about the United States, specifically people like Joe Biden, the president, as that this is a righteous cause, that Zionism is a righteous cause. But you also outline here that there were other more self-interested reasons why the West supported a state in the Middle East that was modeled after Europeans, but also was essentially a place for European Jews. What were those interests? Why was it that the early Jewish Zionist leaders found these allies in Britain and in the United States?
Yeah. Yes, the idea of a Jewish state served different interests. some of these interests even contradicted each other, but they still shared a vision of a Jewish state as an asset that would serve them in the future. So one important group was a particular stream within evangelical Christianity that actually were Zionists even before the Jews became Zionists. In the 17th century already developed these ideas. Some of the leaders developed these ideas. And the idea was that the return of the Jews, as they would call it, the return of the Jews to Palestine, or they would call it the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, was God's will and part of a divine scheme that would eventually lead to the resurrection of the dead, would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, that is Jesus Christ, and begin a new era of Christ's rule in the world. They genuinely, of course, believed in it. We all respect faith and religious ideas. And there were, among them, there were some powerful people who were senior politicians or important members of the judicial system in the United States, and also the financial elite. So that was one group that helped Zionism. The other group was a group of capitalists who, like the Rothschild family, who believed that because they were self-Jewish, that the Jewish projects, economic projects in Palestine could benefit their businesses. A third group were British imperialists. We have to remember that Zionism emerges as an idea when Palestine is still part of the Ottoman Empire. So you can envisage a Jewish state in Palestine, but it's not under your control. And these British imperialists wanted very much Palestine and the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean to be part of the British Empire. So they also liked this idea. And the last group, which is a very interesting group in a way, of Anglo-Jewish aristocrats in Britain who were worried that the rise of anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe would push Jews into Britain. Jews who were poor, who might have adhered to some more radical ideologies or revolutionary ideologies, and they joined forces with people like Lord Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary who granted the infamous declaration, by trying to divert the stream of Jews who understood that Russia was not a safe place, to make sure that they don't come to Britain and divert them to Palestine. So this was the early alliance. Of course, later on, the most important member of the alliance is the United States. Yeah. But that doesn't begin with the United States. We have to remember.
And even the United States during World War II tried to limit the amount of
Jewish
immigration.
Yeah, I think the U.S., many people don't realize it. The U.S., it is true that the United States supported the establishment of a Jewish state after the United Nations General Assembly petition resolution was adopted on the 29th of November 1947. And when Israel declared itself as a state on the 15th of May 1948, the United States recognized Israel. But they did it at the same time as the USSR, the Soviet Union, recognized Israel. It was much more to do with this Cold War politics. There were still a lot of important Americans between 1948, I would say, until the late 1950s, who were not keen on the idea of a Jewish state. And they were quite important. That's why, of course, Israel and the Jewish community established very early on a very powerful and effective lobby. And since the death of President Kennedy, American policy towards Palestine and Israel was going only in one direction.
But you also highlight in 1948, interestingly, it was an election year in the United States. President Truman won that election, but beforehand, there was an attempt by the United States State Department to implement or at least suggest an international trusteeship over the mandate of Palestine. But then you said that there was influence, there was pressure from I guess, the nascent Israel lobby at the time.
Absolutely. The State Department was very logical. It claimed that the United Nations peace plan of partition produced war. And they were already aware that Israel began, or what would become Israel, began ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. So they suggested two things. One is to continue the negotiations, because they saw no logic on imposing a solution that the Palestinians don't accept. They said, so let's continue negotiating for another 5 years and find a solution that is also acceptable to the Palestinians, not only to the Jewish side. And secondly, which is very important, they produced a document in the State Department that envisaged a one democratic state for all, which is unthinkable if you think about America today. A one democratic state for all is the best solution for the question of Palestine. And it was, you're right, it was an election year, and the other candidate, Dewey, understood that this is a weak point in the administration, and he fully supported the idea of a Jewish state, and that, together with a very aggressive pressure on Truman, led him to retract or force the State Department to retract from an already declared American support for the ideas that I was talking about. If you read Harry Truman's autobiography, his description of how he was aggressively approached by the representative of the Jewish Zionist community in America, you can see how abhorred he was by that. But nonetheless, as a politician, he decided to go along with that.
It's quite a stark parallel with the moment that we find ourselves in, which is
Absolutely.
2 weeks out from a U.S. election.
Absolutely.
In which the U.S. government seems unable to exert any kind of diplomatic massaging on the situation and on the Netanyahu government. And then of course you have Trump on the other side, who is lambasting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for not going far enough in supporting Netanyahu and in supporting Israel. How did the situation in the United States get to where it is today, where the idea of, even the suggestion of a one state, as you mentioned, is completely out of the question?
Yeah. Well, I think the work of the lobby, as we know it, what we know it is AIPAC, but it had some earlier outfits with different names. I won't go into it. But they were in action since 1952, 1953. And that's a long time. And they perfected their activity as the years went by and really used very effective methods to make sure that American politicians on whatever level are loyal to Israel. And it took time to intimidate people, to make examples of those who objected or rejected AIPAC. I'm particularly thinking about, and that might give you a good answer to your question, I'm thinking about Biden. Biden as a young, his first appointment on Capitol Hill, I think it was in 1974, I might get the date, but early 1970s. And he serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate. And the very powerful chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Fulbright, is just being exposed as very vulnerable due to the fact that he became enemy number one of AIPAC. Mm-hmm. And AIPAC succeeded in killing the political career of a person who, until that moment, was regarded one of the most powerful politicians in the United States. And they did it because he created a committee already in the early 1960s that looked into the activities of AIPAC as illegal, according to American law, by serving a foreign country and against what he thought was the American national interest. And they destroyed him. It took them probably more than 10, 12 years to do that. But I'm sure this impressed Biden. I have no doubt about it. So already the next generation, the post-Fulbright generation, say if this has happened to Fulbright and I'm not Fulbright, I should be careful. And that becomes inertia. It becomes part of the DNA of an American politician to understand, as one of them, a less senior one, told me, she told me, I don't want to mention names, but she said to me, whenever I suggest even modest criticism of Israel, my friends and my staff reminds me that I'm embarking on a suicidal track, namely political suicidal track. That's how deep is the fear, the intimidation, and you can see how AIPAC is working against candidates, especially African-American candidates today, who are not willing to support the Democratic Party line on Israel. They already succeeded in defeating some of them.
Yeah, Cory Bush.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the same tactics. The tactics, yes, we are not always have 100% success, but we have means to deal with those we fail to impress with our power, and we'll use more power to defeat them. In some cases, they didn't succeed, which is an indication that maybe some of the power is waning, given the fact that a lot of people in American civil society don't share the political elite's views on Palestine in this moment in time.
And it's one of the peculiar things about American politics is how influential, how dominant the power of interest lobbies is in general.
Yep.
And the Israel lobby is by no means unique in that
No.
you have the hold that the firearms lobby has on the Republican Party, and you have the weapons manufacturing lobby, the oil lobby, the tobacco lobby. Why is it so tricky to speak, to write, to document the influence of the pro-Israel lobby on American politics?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that the Israeli lobby works also with other lobbies. There's a very good book by an investigative journalist called Grant Smith that shows the connection between the tobacco lobby and the pro-Israeli lobby. The pro-Israeli lobby can move politicians to vote in favor of the tobacco or arms lobby. I mean, there's a kind of dialectical relationship between these lobbies. They can serve each other's interests if they are powerful. So that's one reason they're so powerful. But it's a good question that there is. I don't think there's a very easy answer on it, because objectively, if presidents, definitely if presidents and foreign secretaries or powerful senators would say, "I'm sorry, no, I'm not impressed by this," and it can't be that you will define my political career, even if in America money is so important for people to be elected. Objectively, it should not have been that successful. I mean, even if what we know about the American system, how it works. So there is another level there. I think it's kind of a combination of the evangelical Christian theology I was talking about, the fact that the Americans themselves are settler colonialists, I think works. The Islamophobia that, especially in the 21st century, gained momentum. So it's not all, they're not all sitting there and calculating coolly, in kind of an objective way, is it good or bad for me to support or not support? It also has to do with kind of other dimensions of the human mind. But as far as I know, none of the lobbies I'm familiar with in America use the same tactics of intimidation and fear and destruction. So I think this is also something to take into account. But definitely it is working on a fertile ground that has to do with American racism, American history, the power of Christian evangelical churches in America. Not all of them. Of course, there are many Christian evangelicals who support Palestine. And altogether, it is creating this inertia. It's almost like a mafia that makes sure that people pay the extortion money, and they don't need all the time to. What do they do? Shoot you on the knee or whatever? I'm not an expert on extortion. I'm borrowing it from Hollywood films.
Yes.
I'm not sure that reflects reality. I know extortion exists, but I'm not sure this is how they work. But with something like that, kind of by inertia. But it's also the weakness of it, because let's see what happens now that so many important sections of American society are not supporting the American line on Palestine. Of course, not enough, but many more than ever before.
And speaking about the Christian Zionists and the Evangelical movement and how influential they are over America's pro-Israel policies, I was speaking to the Jewish American activist Simone Zimmerman, and she raised the point that when we talk about Zionism, the majority of Zionists in the world are not Jewish; they're Christian.
Good point.
And that also makes me think about the way in which a lot of people dismiss the Israel-Palestine conflict as a religious conflict.
Right.
And there is an aspect of it, of course, that is religious, but people don't talk about that from the Christian's perspective.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, first of all, it begins by the fact that Zionism was first an evangelical Christian project before it was a Jewish one. So it's even an older project, the idea of restoring the Jews to Palestine. And definitely there is a connection between their perceptions of an Armageddon or a doomsday scenario and the Messianic Jewish perception of such a vision, different version of it. Yes, I think that they have something in common, and this is trying to portray it as two kinds of struggles. One between the Judeo-Christian civilization and the rest of the world. That could be both a religious idea, but also a racist Western idea that is not just based on religion, it's based on kind of a sense that the famous clash of civilization by Samuel Huntington, that you have the civilized world fighting the non-civilized world, which is mostly Arab, Islamic, and other faiths that are not Western. I think that this is all to obfuscate the fact that the problem in Palestine was never religion. The problem in Palestine, as we described it before, was unfortunately very simple in a way. It is a group of settlers with an ideology that was its main impulse was to dispossess the indigenous people, a displacement and replacement project that got the support of the West for various reasons we described before. And the people there resist this project. They're not interested in Jews as Jews. They're not interested in Christians as Christians. The Palestinians are Christians and Muslims. They used to be also Jews. And like any other normal people, they don't agree with the idea that they should be displaced and dispossessed, and they resist it. Now, here and there, of course, religion plays a role when people believe that maybe a more religious flavor to the resistance would result in better, would bring the people closer to liberation. But we have to look at that history of the Palestinian National Movement, for instance. To begin with, it was very secular. The left was very powerful, but it did not deliver liberation. So people said, if political Islamic groups are continuing the struggle and the rest have given up on the struggle, will give support to these groups. Doesn't mean that everybody agrees with everything that the political Islamic group stands for. But that is where religion comes into it as something which is very important to people and can be political if other political forces are not doing their job. In a similar way, but in a very, of course, contrary way, in Israel, Zionism was a very secular movement. But its project of taking over Palestine and dispossessing the Palestinians was not fully working. So now you have people who say, oh, if we'll be more religious, then we will complete the project, namely getting rid of all the Palestinians and create a Jewish state from the river to the sea. So the interaction with religion is important to analyze, but the core problem was not religion. In fact, the core problem was that the kind of religion we had in Palestine before 1948 that coexisted when three different religious groups coexisted and found a way of living together within the same world, within the same civilization, that was disrupted by a secular movement supported by Western imperialism. And many of us believe that actually recreating that religious coexistence is the only way forward. As my good friend Usama Makdisi wrote in his brilliant book called The Economical Frame, which looks at this coexistence before the arrival of Zionism, not only in Palestine, but also in other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and sees it as a model for the future.
And that also reminds me of Professor Avi Shleim's memoir when he talks about his upbringing as an Arab Jew, and he makes that point that he believes that Arab Jews, the Jewish people that stem from the Middle East, places like Iraq and Morocco and Egypt and Yemen, that they can be a vision for integrating Israel into the region, as opposed to European Jews or their Europeanness of Israel today as this, as you mentioned, a settler colonial force that exists, a kind of a foreign occupying power in the ways in which a lot of Palestinians see the modern state of Israel. And when it comes to the settler aspect of it, these settlers that you describe having arrived before 1948 in the late 19th century, who are these people? What do they believe? What do they arrive to the mandate of Palestine to do?
Mm-hmm. First of all, about the Arab Jews, I hope he's right, because this community has been de-Arabized from above and is more racist than any other section of the Israeli society. Well, we should hope that he's right, that they can return to their roots. And it's not surprised that not one Jew who lived in the Arab world or North Africa has ever thought of the idea of a Jewish state. There was no impulse among Jews living in those countries to think about Zionism. Zionism was brought to them by Israel, by European Jews. Now, as for the settlers, like any settler colonial project, you have the ideological core, but then you have a lot of people who are just immigrants who go along, and then they understand that if they subscribe to the ideology, they get even more benefits, more privileges. My parents are a good example of that. And so people are immigrating because of anti-Semitism, because other places are closed. The United States, Britain, Australia are not opening the gates for Jews, even not during the Holocaust. But they are not the ones who decide the fate of the country. They are led by a group that mostly arrived between 1905 to 1920, a very hardcore ideological group that defined the objectives of the Zionist movement already then, And the objective was very clear. You needed to take as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. That would enable, ironically, the Jewish state to be a democracy as well. They even had some socialist tendencies. And at that point, they didn't even, they still regarded the Jews in the Arab world as Arabs. There were no plans to bring over Jews from the Arab world in the 1920s, when this group actually established what became later the State of Israel. Because of the Holocaust and the fact that the Anglo-American Jewish community did not come in great numbers to Israel, they turned their attention to the Jewish communities in the Arab world in North Africa. And in a very intriguing way, as Avi describes in his book, in the case of Iraq, pushed them towards Israel.
This feels like a simple question, but I think it's something that I've always tried to wrap my head around. The ideologues, the settlers, the notion of Zionism itself, why does it strive for a Jewish state? Why a nation state? What purpose does that give for Jewish people that have always lived for millennia in different parts of the world, different parts of the Middle East? Why a nation state?
Yeah. The reason is that when Zionism emerged in Europe, it answered two impulses. One was to find a way of dealing with anti-Semitism. And the other one was a notion that the Jews are too traditional, too religious, and only modernization of the Jews would decrease anti-Semitism and would offer a better future for the Jewish people. And that turned Judaism not only into a national movement, but into a romantic national movement. In many ways, the nationalism that was the base of the new anti-Semitism in Europe, the German romantic nationalism, the Italian, the Austrian, the French, which was at the heart of the idea that modern Europe did not want the Jews, after years of getting rid of the old anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church. That very idea was very attractive to the early Zionists. They also thought about themselves as a romantic national movement but it needed a state, it needed a country in which to build it. So I think that was part of the DNA of Zionism from the very beginning, that if you believe that the modern Jew is the best way of dealing with anti-Semitism, then the modern Jew needs a state, needs to be part of a romantic national movement, needs to be in the ancient homeland of that movement. All these romantic ideas remind you of German nationalism, Italian nationalism, when kind of right-wing nationalism that believes that there is a golden period in the past that you have to recreate. The Aryan period, the Roman Empire in the case of Italy, and sometimes in the case of Greece, the Greek civilization. We know it from other places in the world. And that meant really a fusion of biblical ideas, if you want, with secular modern ideas. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. What they didn't take into account was that the fact that the secular Jews have taken over a command of the Old Testament, the Bible, the Torah, and turned it into a political, historical book, worked for a while. It worked for a while. But the religious Jews who are really religious said, wait a minute, these secular Jews are not really Jewish in that respect. And the biblical text is not just about the right of the Jews to inherit the Holy Land. It's also about laws, It's about the public domain. the relationship between men and women, the whole kind of judicial system that has to be imposed if you really want to resurrect the old ancient kingdom of Israel. I don't know how much you're familiar with the Old Testament, but one of the most important moral imperative in the Old Testament that also always comes from every prophet that appears in the Old Testament. Every prophet has the same message to the Israelites or the people of Judea later on. And the message is the following: since you are not pious enough in the way that you are maintaining your religious duties, a catastrophe is going to befallen you very soon. Catastrophe usually meant occupation by one of the exactly a kind of a nakba, a repeated nakba that always is connected to the lack of a moral and religious behavior of the society, and they believe in it now as well. So coming back to this issue, it's romantic nationalism that made a state a sacred outfit for Judaism, and now those who in power, or those who are ascending in power in Israel, say a state, yes, but not a democracy, a Jewish theocracy. That's the state that is the ultimate goal of Zionism. But of course, the best thing for Judaism, in my mind, is actually to turn the clock backwards, if it's possible, redefine Judaism as religion, not as nationalism, and forget about the state. Jews have much more to contribute to the world as a stateless people rather than a people with a state. And Judaism is a monotheistic religion. It's not a national movement. And there are many, I think any deterioration in the situation in Israel increases the return of Jews to the pre-state collective identities, which is better for them, and I think is much better for their societies. Think about Iraq and Morocco. How tragic is Zionism for these two countries? They lost their Jewish community that contributed immensely to the culture, economy, and thriving of these two countries. The Jews there became refugees, and they were part of the project of dispossessing the Palestinians. So 3 terrible things that happened as a result of an attempt that was totally alien to Jews in the Arab world, that Judaism is nationalism and not religion.
You talk about the differences in ideologies within Israeli society, and you mentioned the secular Judaism and the religious Judaism, and which you called here, the state of Israel and the state of Judea. Was this always a fracture in Zionism? Was this always a problem that any state of Israel had to ultimately figure out how to deal with?
Yes, it was like a kind of an inside bomb that waited to explode, because until the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, this kind of state of Judea ideology was very marginal and was treated like existing in the lunatic margins of society. But since Israel established settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they became much more organized, armed, and lived exceptional life. Even the Israeli legal system did not apply to them. And that allowed them to increase and expand. They also received privileges, economic privileges, that most Israeli Jews didn't get. So you can see the historical process by which they move from the margins into a very powerful position today. Yes, but it was always there. The contradiction of Zionism as a definition of religion as a political project was always going to haunt the Zionists. but it took time before it really unfolded.
When you look at the figures that have risen to the forefront of that movement, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, the National Security Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, how do you compare them to the early Zionist settlers that arrived to essentially plant the stone of what would become a Jewish state?
In terms of how they perceived the Palestinians and in terms of what they were willing to do to de-Palestinize or de-Arabize Palestine, the difference is not huge. And in that respect, the settlers have a point when they say, we're doing in the West Bank what you did in the rest of Palestine, and we're not doing something you didn't do yourself. In terms of the nature of how would the Jewish society look like, they differ. There's a difference between a socialist, secular vision of a society and a religious, national one. So it depends on what we are looking at, From a Palestinian perspective, there's very little difference.
You mention in the book this idea of a greater Israel lobby. And greater Israel is something that you often hear about with regards to a lot of conspiracy theories about what the intention of Israel is, what the intention of Zionism is. But you mention here that there's always this seed of what the borders of Israel are supposed to be, whether practically or messianically. Yeah. What is greater Israel?
Yes, greater Israel is an idea that while maybe for pragmatic reasons, because of the global balance of power, because of the regional balance of power, Zionism for certain periods in history may have to be content with only part of Palestine. Or that in order to deal with the demographic problem of the Palestinians, you may have to concede certain percentage of historical Palestine. Greater Israel does not accept these two modes of behavior that characterized the Labour Party, that dominated Zionist politics from the 1920s until the late 1970s. The Labour politicians were willing to give up 22% of Palestine in 1948, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, they had the military power to take over without any problem, but it served other purposes. And they were willing since 1967 not to have direct rule in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in order, again, to solve the problem of the Palestinian presence. Namely, in 1948, they expelled 1 million Palestinians or so. In 1967, they said, we can't expel millions of Palestinians, but we can keep them in enclaves without any basic civil and human rights, and that keeps them out of the demographic equation. The Greater Israel lobby never believed in it. It believed that the state will not survive if it doesn't have the whole of historical Palestine, from the river to the sea. And as for the demography, there are different versions. The ideological father of the Likud, Zev Jabotinsky, he said we should be able to offer the Palestinians some rights, but never the same rights as Jews, namely an apartheid state. And if they don't like it, they can leave. And there is a harsher version of it that now Smotrich and Ben-Gvir represent, which says we don't even have to ask them whether they want to stay or not. We should do all we can to downsize the population as much as we can. So that's an ideology. Well, one should say that the Greater Israel lobby is not something that only exists on the Israeli right. Very important young generals from 1948 who were part of the Labour Party during the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967 also believed in the Greater Israel. They had their own version of how to do it. As I mentioned before, they would allow Palestinian autonomous enclaves in the Greater Israel. But actually, in any way you look at it, even the Zionist left never gave up the greater Israel idea, because the Zionist left is the movement that is willing to give the most autonomous rights to the Palestinians as possible, but not full autonomy, not full independence. So to my mind, that's also a greater Israel, kind of a Bantustan. Bantustan did not threaten the territorial integrity of apartheid South Africa. So it sounds as if it's one version of right-wing politics in Israel, but if you look at the Zionist project from beginning to now, it seems most ideological streams, in one way or another, with different versions, thought that Palestine from the river to the sea is the new state of Israel, but some were willing to make concessions with indirect rule for various pragmatic reasons. But now we are ruled in Israel by those who are not even considering such pragmatism.
And you mentioned Zev Jabotinsky, and there's a quote that really stuck out to me that he writes in 1923. Now, he obviously wasn't very fond of the labor Zionists and the Ben-Gurion camp, and accused them of being disingenuous, essentially. I think he called them peacemongers and vegetarians.
Yeah.
But there's a quote by him that says, "Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine, and that watering down our words with making them honeyed and more palatable isn't going to work, because the Palestinians know what we're here to do, what we actually want." He essentially seems to be accusing Ben-Gurion of pretending to want to create a peaceful state with the Palestinians, but in effect that this idea of a greater Israel is really the aim of these early Zionists. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I think it's a very good analysis by Jabotinsky. What he understood was that there are only two options. Either you create a non-Jewish state, and that depends then on the Palestinians and the Arab world to offer how would they like to include the waves of Jewish settlers that came. At the time that he writes it, there are about, 300,000 Jewish settlers in Palestine, a minority. So one option.
Only 5 years after the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah, exactly. So, so there's even less of them. And of course, let's ask the Pan-Arab national movement, the Palestinian national movement, how would they treat us as a minority? And definitely, Palestinians and Arabs were hospitable and were willing to include Jews, not only the original Jews, but also Jews who came as immigrants, but into an Arab-Palestinian political structure. The other option was to create a Jewish state by removing the Palestinians from Palestine. The idea that you can find a third way by doing actually what Jabotinsky suggests, but covering it up by universal values, by deceiving the Palestinians, deceiving yourself, that you can square the circle. I think he understood rightly that it's not going to work. We can see it today. In other words, he didn't think that there was a liberal colonizer or a progressive settler. There were only two options. And I think he analyzed clearly the main problem of the Zionist left, which explains why it disappeared. They're trying to square the circle in a world that towards people who are knowledgeable, are not stupid, and there's already an historical experience nowadays, which wasn't there before, how deceptive this exercise is and how ingenuine. It's not a genuine one. Yes, unfortunately, today, if you ask the Jewish society to choose between a democracy and a racist ethnic state, they go for the latter option.
And that idea of a single state, which is what, ironically, a lot of pro-Palestinian advocates have been advocating for, the idea of having a single state in which both Jews and Palestinians are equal, has been rejected by, most people, really, on both sides of the equation. But recently, you are starting to hear this language from the Israeli right about the idea of a single state and about the idea of the expulsion of Palestinians and the drive towards sort of like an end state solution. Do you think this is what we are seeing happening today?
No, I think what we have here is something different. There is one state. There has been for a while now, at least for 24 years, even longer. There is one state in Palestine, and that state is called the State of Israel. And it rules the Palestinians with different legal systems, one for the West Bank, one for the Gaza Strip, one for Jerusalem, one for inside Israel. And the whole conversation, to my mind, is not about one state or two state solution. The conversation is about a regime change. Do we allow this regime to continue, a regime of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide? Or are we striving to replace it with something else? That's the first question. My answer is yes, we are striving to replace a regime of apartheid with a democratic regime. Second question is, who should be the driver in this path to transformation? The world says any solution should be led by Israel because of the balance of power. This was the logic of the peace process until now. I say no. The logic is that the Palestinian Liberation Movement should lead the way to the regime change and offer the alternative to that regime. And they should tell the Jews in Israel, how do they see the millions of Jews in a new regime? Do they see it as a one person, one vote, and then it doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or not? Or would they like to respect, as they do in the Eastern Mediterranean, a certain ethnocultural Jewish collective? Or maybe they even are willing to offer the Jews a binational state. I'm not going into it. I have my own views, but that's not the point. The point is who are the ones who are going to lead the conversation. And right now there is no Palestinian leadership that can do it. There's no Palestinian organization can do it. We can only hope that this would happen very soon.
When it comes to this idea of a one state, the fear would be that, as you said, in effect, there is a one state, and that the international consensus, as flawed as it is, has been to push for two states. And now you are hearing voices, not just in Israel, but in some on the American right, that are advocating for a single state, and that this should be a Jewish state. So somebody like David Friedman, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, he just published a book called One Jewish State, where he advocates for a relationship with the Palestinians similar to the U.S. has with Puerto Ricans, where they are technically under the umbrella of Americans, but they don't have full rights. They don't vote, for example. And he says that someone like Donald Trump doesn't really mind and doesn't really have an ideological leaning. Do you worry that this is going to be the direction that what used to be the peace process is going to head towards?
No, not worried at all, because the peace process is not a peace process. And I'm looking at the process of decolonization that already has started and is going to succeed. And I don't care what David Friedman is writing about. It's irrelevant to the progress of history. It can put obstacles on the way to liberation and freedom, but it will not stop liberation and freedom or decolonization. Palestine would be decolonized. That's a fact that people should understand. The problem is, it's not a question of if. The question is of when. And when is, of course, very important, because the longer we wait for the decolonization, the more suffering people like Friedman and his friends can help Israel to impose. But that is not the conversation that is important to anyone in Palestine. I think we're beyond that. That's why the whole conversation of the day after, led by the US and the West and some of the Arab countries, as if the day after is still based on a two-state solution, is irrelevant to the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is not conducive for such a conversation. It's almost like talking about a Palestine that exists somewhere else. Maybe they know of it. No, we are now in the midst of an historical process that already began, and you can delay the disintegration of Israel. You can delay the decolonization, but you won't succeed in stopping it. And it's, in fact, for the benefit of everyone, the Jews and the Palestinians, having the right conversation instead of the wrong conversation is really what is important. And the two-state conversation is not the right conversation. Maybe there were periods in history in which it were. It's possible. But the only conversation that the two-states solution is leading to is to perpetuate the current reality. A two-state solution would not stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It would not stop the genocidal policies of Israel. It would not allow one refugee to return. It would not respect the Palestinian right of self-determination. So what's the point of giving you support for just an alternative way to continue the present apartheid regime? No, if America cannot join the conversation, whether it's Trump or Kamala Harris, we should hope, and this is also possible, that America would not be that important in the future of the Arab world. When people ask me, do you foresee any change in American policy towards Palestine? I have to admit I don't, not in the near future. But I say I'm not sure that this is what I'm working for. I'm working for persuading the Americans to get out of the Middle East, which would benefit everyone living in the Middle East. America's legacy since the Second World War is a very negative one. And therefore, I'm not worried about such things. If you ask me what I'm worried about, is that the Palestinian national movement is not exploiting this historical moment to come up with a clear vision of a one-state solution that we can all gather around, galvanize us, and we will do our job as well to make it happen. But we cannot do it if there are still Palestinian leaders talking about two-state solution, if there's still fragmentation, disunity. But I'm optimistic. I think it will happen. And then it would be much easier to push, I hope, for a more peaceful, quicker decolonization of Palestine.
The last thing I want to talk to you about, and it's to your point with regards to the fallacy of this two-state solution, is to talk about Gaza, and to talk about the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And you write in this book, and you've spoken before, that the Gaza Strip itself is an invention of Israel. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, the Gaza Strip was created. I mean, Gaza until 1948 was a small town, but a very thriving one, by the way, where Jews, Muslim, and Christian lived. And it was a kind of a district capital for the area around it. Its location on the Via Maris, the road from Egypt to Turkey, meant that it was very cosmopolitical. A lot of people from different cultures passed through that. And that was its organic existence. Israel created the Strip, which is different from Gaza, because it had a problem with the hundreds of thousands of refugees it expelled from the center and south of Palestine. The Palestinians that were expelled during the Nakba from the north were expelled over the border to Lebanon, Syria, and some in the center to the West Bank. But Egypt did not open the border in the Sinai Peninsula, and therefore Israel decided, so to speak, to give up a strip in that area to make it a big refugee camp, because these people were not allowed into Egypt, so they pushed them into this strip of 280, 290 square kilometers. And that's how Gaza was created, as a geopolitical solution for the demographic wish of Israel to downsize the number of Palestinians they have to deal with directly, or that they might be forced to give them citizenship, and whose land and houses they coveted. So that's how the strip was created as a mega refugee camp, and when it began to resist in the 1990s, it became a mega prison, a ghetto. And now, of course, it's a killing field of genocidal policies. So from very early on, unlike the West Bank, where the Israelis thought that either with Jordan or pushing people to Jordan, convincing a lot of Jews were willing to go to the West Bank, Gaza was always a problem. It had a huge concentration of refugees. The number of settlers who were willing to go there was very small. That's why Ariel Sharon could take them out in 2005. And naturally was a very resistant kind of community. And they used the 7th of October as a pretext to upgrade their action or their solution for the Gaza Strip.
And what is the relationship between the Gaza Strip as it exists today and the areas around it?
It's totally disconnected from it by a barbed wire, even before the 7th of October, now even more so. There's no exit to the world. There is a maritime blockade on it. It's really it's a mega prison is the best way of describing it.
And what happened on the 7th of October? There was a part of it where some of the people that left, maybe not necessarily the Hamas fighters, but some of the ordinary people that left, were trying to go back to villages in the surrounding areas that they had come from, right?
Absolutely. Because the last wave of expulsion in 1948 into the new strip that was created was from villages very near the strip. And on the lands, or sometimes on the ruins of that villages, some of the Jewish settlements that the Hamas attacked on the 7th of October were built. So yes, some people felt that they're coming back, not them, but the third generation or second generation returning to where their ancestors came from. Definitely, that is part of what was going on there. But it did provide a pretext for Israel to, I would say, move from an incremental genocide it already imposed on Palestine. And I used that term in 2010 already. I said that 3 years into the siege, I noticed, with the help of analysis from the United Nations Human Rights Organization, that the people of Gaza are incrementally starved and denied basic health infrastructure. And I was worried already in 2010 that this is something that can be genocidal, namely that people don't just die because they're being shot at, but there are other ways in which their life can be affected. And now, of course, it's much more explicit in terms of mass killing and so on. But that is how Israel used the attack to implement something that many of his generals and politicians wanted beforehand.
And finally, Professor Ilan, we are living through a historic moment, and it's hard to predict what comes next, but it is definitely the most catastrophic moment for Palestinians and for Israelis since the beginning, since 1948. And out of this moment, you talk about the idea of decolonization. What are the first steps to that? Where do you see the situation going from the moment that it's in, which feels like it's the furthest place from a kind of resolution? Where is the first step to being able to heal from what the trauma of what has been experienced over the last 75 years?
I think we have to distinguish between two processes. One is already happening, and that's the beginning of the disintegration of Israel. Huge fundamental problems that I can't see Israel being able to solve, which can lead to all kinds of scenarios. Of course, I cannot know exactly how it will unfold, but knowing from history, there are various ways in which countries become failed states. And we have examples nearby: Syria, Libya, Yemen, Lebanon precariously getting there, and as well as Iraq is not over that danger either. So the disintegration of the state, that is usually a very violent process, where the state loses control of large swaths of land, as happened to Syria. Israel is already finding it difficult to control the north, to control the West Bank. Of course, it will use the same methods it used in the Gaza Strip if it feels that it cannot do it, but it is also self-destruction. The implosion of the Jewish society from within, what we talked about, the lack of any common base between the secular and religious Jews, the growing international isolation of Israel, the distancing of Jews, especially young Jews, from Israel as an idea, from Zionism, the economic crisis that Israel is unable now to solve. It needs American help like never before. Also the invincibility of the Israeli army is in question, given what happened. All these discrete processes can fuse together into a chaotic moment where the 500,000 of Israelis already left since 7th of October, the number would double or triple. So there could be this creation of a void. The second process is anyone there able to fill the void? Because if you don't fill the void, the chaos, as we can see in Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, this integration can take 30 years, 40 years, unless the national Palestinian movement, the region, the international community comes and says, wait a minute, we have a different scenario here. Okay, this is not working. What is working? One democratic state, I don't know, binational state. At this moment in time, this is not the question. The question, as I said, is both the nature of the solution, but who is offering the solution. And the moment the region and the international community would willing to see the Palestinians as the people who determine the future in Palestine, in conversation with the Israeli Jews, no doubt, but they are moving them from being the secondary actor into the main actor.
From being the problem into
the
being
problem
the solution.
into being the solution, exactly. Could turn the decolonization not just a process of deconstruction and destruction, but into construction. And we have to be wary of it, because look at decolonizations around the world. Quite often, what replaced the colonial regime was nothing to write home about. It was, I don't know, as bad or not as bad, but it was something that people felt is not what they were fighting for. Look at some countries in Africa, some countries in the Arab world. So a lot of us have great faith that Palestine would be different. That because it hasn't been yet decolonized, there's no Palestine state yet. We all hope that this would be the most, not the success, but a better model of success compared to many other projects of decolonization. I think that's why so many people pin their hopes about Palestine as being a beacon that would impact the area as a whole for how to rebuild the political structures in the Arab world, that in that part of the Arab world, Eastern Mediterranean, what we call in Arabic the Mashriq, that was built by the colonial powers after the First World War. So we are all hoping that from Palestine, the message of let's reshuffle it, restructure politics and political institutions and outfits so that they respond better to the concerns and the needs of the people. There are too many hungry people in the Arab world, there are too many angry people in the Arab world. And this is a world that used to lead the world's civilization, gave the lead on everything. And I hope it will play such a role in the future.
Professor Ilan Pappé, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a huge thank you to our guest today, Professor Ilan Pappé. If you haven't checked out his work before, I highly suggest you do. The 3 books that I would recommend are The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and the other 2 books that we mentioned during our conversation, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, and of course, A Very Short History of the Israeli-Palestine Conflict. As always, we want to hear what you have to say about this conversation, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below, and you can listen to this episode in audio format alongside all of our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.